All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's Geopolitics of Technology Series. Before we begin, my name is Courtney Dogger, and I'm the president of Network 2020. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time or who would want a refresher, Network 2020 is an inclusive international community, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. We try to leverage emerging, established, and entrepreneurial leaders to highlight and drive innovative solutions to challenges that fall in the international affairs realm. We are on all different social media, so please do follow us there. Also subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would greatly appreciate it. So today we will have a very interesting conversation. As I've been reflecting recently, they say that history is written by the victors, but increasingly it also seems like it is being written by the algorithms. And at stake really are our human brains, which apparently now consume as much information in a day as a person did in a lifetime centuries ago. And even so, our consumption is limited to the vast amounts of information that is out there. So what we take in shapes our view of the world around us and trust in our societies. And as our former speaker and Nobel Prize winner, Maria Ressa said, when you don't have facts, truth, and trust, you don't have democracy. So what are the tools that individuals and governments can use to generate, distribute, and filter information? And how are those tools shaping the broader geopolitical environment? So we will be exploring all of those questions today and are very fortunate to be joined by Kalev Leetaru and Chris Meserole to talk about information, misinformation, and the technology that is shaping our world. Kalev is an American internet entrepreneur, academic, and fellow at the George Washington University School of Engineering and Applied Science Center for Cyber and Homeland Security. He is also the founder of GDELT, the Global Database of Events, Language, and Tone, which is an initiative that catalogs behavior and beliefs across all countries of the world. And that is just a very reductive explanation of what it does. We're also pleased to welcome Chris Meserole. He's fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution and director of research for the Brookings Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technology Initiative. So welcome both of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. Chris, I'm going to start where I usually like to start, which is with a definition question. So what is it exactly that we're talking about when we use the term misinformation, just because its meaning seems to have different connotations depending on different contexts. And so I'd love for you just to define how you think about misinformation and how technology is enabling or enabling its production and distribution.
Yeah, well, first of all, just thank you for having me, and thank you for setting up this conversation. It's a real pleasure to be here, and an honor to be able to contribute to this forum. But as far as kind of the question about what misinformation is and what disinformation is, there's a lot of terms that have been used in this kind of political discourse around it. Fake news, deep fakes, misinformation. And I think the main point I would make as far as trying to wrap your head around what it actually is that we're talking about when we think about misinformation is that there's really two ways that you can inject inject into kind of the information environment or political discourse of a society the kind of information that can erode trust in that discourse. And that one way to do that is to take something that has a kernel of truth to it and just take it out of context and blow it up and amplify it or kind of reframe it in a way that's very misleading. And that is really what we mean when we think about misinformation, right? And a good example of this would be, a lot of the critiques that we saw of, say, like vaccines and kind of the misinformation that flooded out around the pandemic and vaccines, where you had folks saying, well, we know that some people who have gotten the vaccine have had like heart attacks, for example, and therefore we can't trust. And it's like, well, there is a truth there, right? Like if you vaccinate tens of millions of people, some of them are going to have heart attacks. But that doesn't mean that there's a causal relationship between the vaccine and that impact. And it certainly doesn't mean that vaccines are harmful. That's kind of where we need to kind of inject better science and science reporting into the conversation. But the idea of misinformation is really information that might have a piece of truth to it, but that is being used in a way that's very misleading for a particular kind of political outcome or agenda. That's different from what we might think of as disinformation, which is more where kind of fake news comes into play, where it's really information that's deliberately misleading and a falsehood. And there, a good example would be in its most outlandish form, again, to kind of use vaccines as an example here, the idea that like vaccines are injected with microchips that are then going to kind of, it's like the state control, the state's going to have control over people who get a vaccine because, they've kind of put this new technology in there. Obviously that's false, but that's kind of what more traditionally disinformation has referred to as opposed to misinformation. They are both really problematic in that both of them undermine the trust that individuals have in the kind of integrity of the broader information ecosystem that they're a part of, and in the kind of information that they're hearing from political leaders. I think to the point about how there's kind of being produced and disseminated now, I think one of the things that's different about misinformation and disinformation, both of which have really existed for centuries, really as long as politics has existed, the incentive to distort information has also existed. What's new is that we have these kind of smartphones in our pockets, and kind of all of us have laptops, and it's very easy now for us to create fake information, whether that's text or audio or video. On the one hand, it's very easy for us to create this kind of misinformation and disinformation. And on the other, and in some ways even more importantly, it's very easy now, by virtue of the social networks and social media that have grown up over the last 10 or 15 years, and the sheer scale, the global scale that they've now reached, the algorithms that govern how information flows through those platforms have gotten really good at figuring out what kind of users are most responsive to. And most of the time what they're most responsive to in many cases is like the most sensationalized content, which often is content that is maybe, just has had the truth fudged a little bit or is outright false, right? And so misinformation and disinformation have always existed, but now they're actually really well positioned to actually perform extremely well in the information ecosystem that's emerged around social media, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or Twitter. We now have ways, for those who are kind of interested in injecting misinformation and disinformation into the discourse, it's pretty straightforward to get some of these narratives, like very problematic, misleading narratives, whether it's about vaccines or politics, into the mainstream political discourse by virtue of just the sheer scale of these platforms and the way that algorithms have learned to disseminate them. So I'll stop there for now. There's a lot more I can kind of unpack, but that's kind of at a high level how I think about the issue now and kind of why it's so problematic at the moment.
Great, thanks, Chris. Kalev, what about you? Do you have a similar take on the term? And you've been looking at a ton of data, and what does that tell you about the pervasiveness of misinformation circulating?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. And thank you so much for having me here today. I think one of the greatest mistakes that we oftentimes make in this space is to oversimplify things, to say, well, there's kind of this misguided notion that there's right and wrong to every question. Certainly some questions, especially if they're of a factual nature, there is a right or a wrong answer to that. But so much, we sort of have this idea oftentimes, especially in the technology world, that there's a right answer to every question. And our job as technologists and social platforms and the rest are to essentially silence those wrong answers. And there's a whole bunch of different interesting things with this. So one is, we've been rushing to build these tools that allow centralized control of narratives. But as we're seeing across the world, governments are now using those tools to their own political ends. There's so many examples across the world of even democratic governments using ordering social platforms to, silence debate, anti-government criticism, protests, and other activities. And oftentimes the questions oftentimes the questions that are sort of central to the conversation, the ones that we want to either debunk or approve, are the ones that we don't know. So take the example of the 10-year-old with the abortion. I mean, even the fact checker stepped in, even the Washington Post fact checker stepped forward and said, we can't disprove this, but there's a lot of questions about this. We really, really have to be cautious about accepting this narrative. It even condemned its own paper of saying, look at all of our reporters just rushing off accepting this story. And there's real questions. And that in turn led to this whole narrative that, this just isn't real. This is a fake news. Look, even the Wash Post is debunked, which they didn't. They simply said there's a lot of questions here. But again, that's because, and of course, now we know the story was very, very real, and there was a lot of harm to that. The fact checkers kind of stepping in, attempting to debunk that. And that's again the question that oftentimes fact checkers, we don't have those writers. People know, but oftentimes there's sort of those, whether it's social platforms or O's, they're not in the position to really be able to answer those questions. But worse, oftentimes this fight towards disinformation can suppress accurate information. So recall in the early days of the pandemic, the US government, public health authorities, Fauci, Surgeon General, all those stepped forward and said, do not wear a mask. There was a very famous CDC exchange. It was a media briefing. It was a CDC media briefing for American media. They said, look, we need your help. We're seeing increasing reports that people are starting to wear masks. Americans are attempting to wear masks because they're seeing in Europe people wear masks. We need your help to stop that. Do whatever you need to do, leverage the power of you as the media to stop Americans from wearing masks. And later on, I asked, a while later, a couple months after this, I asked Facebook and I said, you now have a policy that says if someone posts something that runs contrary to a current CDC guidance, that you'll take that down and ban that user. What would have happened if this policy had been in effect a few months ago? And let's say a major leading American doctor stepped forward on Facebook and said, I'm a public health authority. I strongly believe that we should be wearing masks. If you look in Europe, everyone's wearing masks. And their answer was, yes, under our policy, yes, we would have to remove that and probably ban that person for life. And that's a huge, huge problem. And it's a really interesting issue. And of course, you also had another famous example there with blood clots. So early on, the policies all banned mentions of blood clots associated with any of the vaccines. And so what you saw was a lot of people starting to step forward, and especially in certain demographics, saying, I experienced blood clots from this. And of course, you had the social media companies stepping in, removing all that information. And later on, that turns out that actually was a legitimate medical symptom for certain demographic groups. And then you had to all the platforms had to then alter those policies to say, well, now we're going to allow that. And there was a lot of interesting questions raised of what would happen in the early days if that policy had not been in effect. And we've been able as public health authorities to see, wow, there's something systematic here. But more importantly, disinformation is increasingly becoming shorthand for other political views. For the past year and a half, CNN, MSNBC, they really haven't talked about inflation. When sort of left or center kind of left media have talked about inflation, it was always contextualized as yet another right-wing conspiracy theory. And actually a number of outlets actually use the term disinformation to say that it's harmful falsehoods being propagated to harm the administration. Whereas Fox News and more right-leaning outlets were running a lot of coverage of inflation. And the reason wasn't that it was fake and it was false and a right-wing conspiracy thing and disinformation. It was two very different halves of America were experiencing rising costs very differently. The side of America that was sort of the CNN, MSNBC crowd, rising prices weren't really having an impact on. They were able to absorb it. It wasn't hurting them. For more of the Fox News viewership, rising prices were having a huge impact on their ability to live, their ability to afford food. And that's just one of many examples. But we see this increasingly now across the world. You see saying, well, anyone who disagrees with me, that's disinformation. And finally, and I will add as well that we're actually starting to see the weaponization of that. So in the case of Russia, for example, they're recognizing we don't have the power as the Russian state to truly censor information here. We don't have that control. So what we're going to do here is Russian media. It's amazing. If you watch Russian television, anything that's negative about the war, they're plastering it all over television, like Bucha, nonstop, wall-to-wall coverage. Many countries like China, it's censored. In Russia, it was wall-to-wall coverage with fake news, disinformation. And so that was a really interesting thing of saying, look, everyone's talking about this, so let's put this all out here and say, oh, it's all fake, it's all fake. And so that's something I think we need to think about is that, we like to say, hey, there's a right and wrong answer to everything. And certainly for some things there are, but oftentimes those are the ones like the 10-year-old abortion, like the fact checkers stepped forward. That was yet another case where they were not able to render an accurate verdict there because they didn't have that information. And we're increasingly sort of acting as if, well, we're always going to have answer to that. But then so many of the things that we tame is disinformation. I mean, certainly vaccines and microchips, there's a right and wrong answer to that. That's a factual question. But we tend to then sort of reach beyond that to all these other pieces there. And it's not just social media. I'll also say the loss of local media. It's a huge deal. It's a famous graph I did a number of years ago showing the plunge towards negativity of American media and actually global media across the world with the rise of the web. Competition, the loss of local media, the fact it could go anywhere, we had to go. So it's not just social media being, we say, oh, well, it's on Twitter and social media, people have to be all exaggerated and extreme. That's what we're seeing in mainstream media, that huge plunge towards negativity, that huge rise towards emotional, fantastical language. These are huge, huge things. And we're consuming all that increasingly on these tiny little cell phones where even the URL scrolls away. So we lose that context. So I'll just kind of leave it with that we tend to oversimplify this and say, hey, the issue here is there's all these falsehoods and we need to build tools to get rid of them. It's so much more complicated than that. And our risk as we sort of, especially technologists, say, oh, look, it's a simple question. We have the fact checkers, we do this, we define the falsehoods and we build tools to get rid of that. There's this hugely dangerous space as we've seen throughout the pandemic, as we're increasingly seeing governments around the world weld these new powers. We really need to step back and kind of think about this, not oversimplify it like technologists do, but actually think about this for real.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the common theme I hear between the two of you is almost the lack of logic. Like we've become so attuned to just doing whatever our phones tell us or believing whatever our phones tell us that the logic sort of evaporates. Chris, I wanted to turn to you now just to talk a little bit about who the different actors are and what their motivations are. And also in line with your research on digital authoritarianism and challenges posed by extremist recruitment and mobilization online, who really stands to gain the most from the use of misinformation and why? And again, you might want to differentiate that between disinformation versus the focus on misinformation.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just kind of build on your question actually by going to the kind of one of the original quotes you gave at the outset of this conversation was from Maria Ressa, that kind of quote that, without, facts and truths and trust, you don't have democracy. And I think it's worth, before answering the question of like who has an incentive to use kind of misinformation and disinformation, I think it's worth laying out, when we think about democracy and kind of the value of why, we place so much, or why we place so much emphasis on democracy. Part of that is a legitimacy story, right? Like everybody has the vote, everybody kind of gets to participate in democracy, and therefore democracy is kind of legitimate or more legitimate than other forms of government. There's also a counterpoint or like a kind of a parallel argument in favor of democracy that we all kind of implicitly adhere to, which is that democratic governments are also going to outperform others because so long as you have a free and open information environment, individuals are going to kind of, if everybody's left to kind of share information with each other, true information eventually gets filtered to the top, and the policies that we, democracies produce will generally be better policies than other regimes around the world. And that's really an argument less about the legitimacy of democracy, more about just the credibility of it as a governing kind of institution. And the challenge there, and the challenge of kind of misinformation and disinformation is there are a lot of actors out there who have a vested interest in undermining the credibility and performance of democratic governments. And so on the one hand, you have domestic actors within a democracy who have a vested interest in trying to leverage misinformation and disinformation to undermine the government power. On the other hand, you often have foreign governments that try to interfere in the information environment of democracies in a way that, again, kind of undermines this notion of the integrity of the information space and kind of democratic deliberation. And so there's kind of two kind of examples that I would give of this. And I want to be mindful of the point that Kalev made earlier that, like stretching the truth, misleading, that's been around in politics forever. And I don't know that we necessarily want to just kind of label everything with a broad brush as disinformation. I think we do want to parse out misinformation and disinformation. So I'll just stick with disinformation. I think a good example of disinformation would be the big lie, right? From a domestic actor that has an incentive to use this kind of information. You saw Steve Bannon and others kind of on the far right, and I did a big kind of research project on this earlier this year. Immediately after the 2020 election in November, they kind of began mobilizing around this notion that the election was stolen. And that happens after a lot of elections. You'll often see kind of claims that maybe there's some fraud or that the election wasn't legitimate. what distinguished what the kind of Bannon wing of the Republican Party kind of did from other forms of kind of allegations of electoral fraud is they continued that narrative even after the legal system had investigated it and concluded that there was no kind of major electoral fraud at all, and that the election was actually one that took place with integrity. So even after the safe harbor deadline of mid-December 2020, when all the kind of attorney generals of the states had verified the election results, Steve Bannon and others were kind of, on radio and on podcasts and on other media out there really pushing this idea that Trump was the rightful victor, that Biden had lost, that there was a lot of fraud that happened. And in that case, they have a very vested interest in doing that, right? They were trying to keep Trump in power. They did not particularly care about the legitimacy of American democracy. They cared much more about kind of maintaining their power at that point in time. And so that's one kind of class of actor that is very drawn to this kind of information tactic. The other is kind of foreign actors. And so we've seen Russia and China very deliberately take advantage of the open access that democracies have to inject misleading narratives. Most notably, like Kalev mentioned, some of the things that Russia did around Ukraine. China's been doing similar around the pandemic, and it's a way of if you don't have a vested interest in maintaining the legitimacy and credibility of democracy, misinformation and disinformation are really great tactics at your disposal. And so the question for democracies, which maybe we can come back to later in the conversation, is what to do about that and how to begin to push back on it.
Great, thanks, Chris. Kalev, I'd like to talk a little bit about the GDELT project. Could you just elaborate for us what you've learned from it, and what does it tell us about the behaviors of these, information flows globally, and how we can measure, understand, and perhaps stop that flow of misinformation beyond just monitoring it?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So the idea of the GDELT project, which is all open data, just GDELT project.org, and it's essentially a live catalog of global media. We attempt to monitor as much media as we can worldwide. And one of the fascinating things about that is you really see the role of media in society. You see narrative spread across the world. And I did this big report last year for RealClearPolitics, actually looking at kind of the history of censorship in the United States, and then the early web and how censorship kind of came into the web. And one of the really fascinating things that you see in that is kind of America as a whole kind of learning from what happened in the rest of the world, and saying really it's a fascinating kind of space. And one of the, I think the biggest things that we think about, if we try to talk about where does truth come from and who arbitrates truth, and how do we kind of enforce, or what are the penalties for falsehoods? America has this long and fascinating history with grappling with that. And of course, the Supreme Court, I think it was Harlan that famously said, the freedom of speech and what constitutes unacceptable speech is the most intractable problem, as he put it, in the history of the Supreme Court. And these are these fascinating things. And as we look across the world, we and even here within the United States, we kind of forget that the idea of media is being objective. We think today that the news, when we open up a newspaper, its role is to be objective, to tell us the truth, so to speak. And we forget that was a post-World War II invention. Prior to that, we still had the party paper model, and we're still moving back towards the party paper model. And we forget in the 1950s, the New York Times cheered on the anti-gay movement as governments and companies were purging those who were LGBTQ. You had the New York Times running headlines: "Perverts purged," "Government must do more," and this is the New York Times. And so we think about today of, well, newspapers, they're truth and they're good and they're not, bringing in these other things. No, they actually do reflect the societal zeitgeist of the moment. And this is one of the things that we see in GDELT as we look across the world. What we really see front and center is that the media is far more complex. Financial, again, I've been a journalist for a number of years, writing for many different outlets. And if you're not a journalist, you also don't realize to what degree economic pressures come in. You're doing a big story about a major corporation, maybe it's labor issues or racism or sexism or horrible things. And you'll have that, maybe that company's a major advertiser, and you'll get that pushback. Hey, we really don't want this story to run. I've personally gotten emails, went up to my editors that said, hey, we really don't want this story to run because that would be harmful for us. And, we do a lot of advertising in your magazine or your newspaper, and stories get killed all the time. So we kind of, we don't realize to what degree economic, in some countries, of course, media is more and more owned by oligarchs. And again, sometimes it's state controlled, sometimes state adjacent. And one of the things in GDELT is because we look at global narratives, we're able to see as these narratives kind of evolve and then they abruptly wither and die, to what degree narratives spread, to what degree different topics. I mean, here, you certainly have seen as newspapers have shifted towards the coast, as there's been more of a consolidation, you certainly see less coverage of things like organized labor, or you see a shift towards, well, labor unions are bad because they raise costs. Because again, if you're a coastal person, well, labor union is bad to you because you're a consumer, versus you saw more in the local papers that are dying, more of a, well, my community is labor. And so you can see all this rich things. And so to me, it's really kind of that societal zeitgeist of media. There is no such thing as, well, here's a source of objective truth, and we head towards this. Even the news media, whether it's whether it's governments or news media or all these other sources, we really realize that the information ecosystem is much more impacted by these factors. And by scooping up, we monitor today 150 languages, soon to be over 400. And we scoop this up from across the world with a real focus on local. And you see this enormous divide between local press all the way up to national press. And you can see ownership shifts as, for example, a wealthy person buys a newspaper. Almost overnight, you can see shifts start occurring in its coverage. And in turn, you can start seeing that impact policy decisions, impact public awareness. I mean, again, if the media is not talking about something, how, we feel that, but we sort of feel isolated. Well, maybe I'm the only one that senses that. So again, that's, I think, one of the greatest things is when you kind of move out of that filter bubble and you look at the media ecosystem as a whole, you really realize, again, how complex this landscape is.
Right, great, thank you. I'm going to try to get a couple more questions in before I turn to the Q&A box. And just for those in the audience, if at any time you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box and I'll try to get to those soon. I'm just going to see if I can get a couple more in. Chris, turning to you, what are some of the state responses to misinformation? And what does your research show about how authoritarian and illiberal regimes and even democratic ones are embracing misinformation as a new norm?
Thanks. It's a great question, and I would say that there's kind of three when it comes to state responses to how disinformation is being used increasingly by regimes around the world. There's kind of three responses, and the first is just a very simple one of do no harm. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of arguments that as China or Russia or other regimes, other authoritarian regimes increasingly leverage this kind of tactic, that democracies should do the same thing. And I think that would be a grave mistake. I don't think we want to kind of encourage democratic governments to go around playing the disinformation game around the world and trying to fight fire with fire. I don't think that's how we win, because that just further undermines the truth, the legitimacy of truth and the credibility of truth. And that's not, I think, in the long-term interests of any kind of democratic society. The second thing is to really clean up our own house. And what I mean by that is part of the challenge of responding to rogue actors who leverage disinformation is that we don't actually have a great sense of what's happening in our information ecosystem. We don't have a lot of transparency into the technologies I mentioned earlier, in particular recommendation algorithms on major social media platforms. We don't have a great sense of how information flows through those platforms, or kind of how the most sophisticated information operations are taking place. And that's something where I think we need a lot more work between civil society and the tech industry to get a better understanding of just the scope of the problem and how to move forward with it. And then the third kind of thing, after kind of doing no harm and cleaning the house, is to really begin to push back aggressively. And I think this is where I think we've started to see democratic governments begin to be a little bit more effective over the last year or so. There's still more we can do, but I think too, an example would be in the lead up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Biden administration, I think, to their credit, was pretty masterful about pre-bunking Russian disinformation narratives. Right? They knew what was coming, and they selectively released information in advance that normally they would have held onto as classified, in a bid to effectively inoculate the public to these allegations that Russia was going to make. And I think that was a tremendously effective tactic in winning the war for public support in Europe and North America in particular, because it was clear what Russia was doing, and when they then tried to do it, it fell on deaf ears. In addition to that, there's also just a lot of private information sharing that the government can do about what kind of authoritarian regimes are doing and the disinformation they're peddling. The administrations can share information privately with other government officials around the world. This is something that we're seeing in particular in East Asia in response to some of China's kind of more aggressive information maneuvering. And I think it's been very effective at shoring up kind of public support and support of our allies in both Europe and in East Asia against China. And so I think it's not the same as fighting fire with fire, where democracies are just using disinformation themselves, but there are a lot of other levers and mechanisms that we can use to win the information competition without resorting to a cure that's worse than the disease itself. So thankfully, there's a lot we can do to push back.
Very good, and hopefully we'll get into some of those. Kalev, the question I was about to ask you was future looking, but I'm scrolling through the Q&A box and there's a lot of really good questions in here, and one of them aligns with what I was going to ask you. So I am going to deviate to the Q&A box now, and hopefully we'll be able to get to as many of these as possible. So the questioner writes, Kalev, you've mentioned that the problem of misinformation stems from a common lack of digital literacy across society. Open quote, our susceptibility to blindly believing what we read on the web and our failure to verify and validate information before we share or act upon it. End quote. But these issues have existed for hundreds of years. How is it possible to sort through the torrent of information that we have in 2022? Where do the solutions begin, and what predictions do you have about where they end?
Absolutely, and I think ultimately, from my perspective, when I look at this, people, they rush to blame social media and they say this is all social media's fault. And, again, because I look globally through the GDELT project, because we're looking across the entire planet, including areas where social media has not really reached the traction that it has in more digitally connected areas, we see these very same problems manifest across the world. And so my perspective is much more, and I'm also much more cognizant to the fact that the more we talk about, well, we need to remove what quote unquote disinformation is. And, imagine for those, in the aftermath of the big lie, you saw a lot of Congress saying, what, we need the US government to have the right to define what's real and not. And tell social media platforms to remove this. And my answer to that always is, especially if you are a Democrat, if Donald Trump is reelected, do you really want him to be able, to define what is real and false and have the authority to remove that? And that's something, again, that we've always sort of recognized and kind of grappled with here. So my answer to this has always been, well, what about this idea of focusing more on information literacy? Of context. So when you pull up a news article, for example, on your phone, the moment you start scrolling upwards, the URL disappears on most browsers, on most phones. The context, those hyperlinks, you see a link, it says, well, according to blank, but oftentimes we don't even see that. You just see 88% of blank, and that 88% is a hyperlink. Most people wouldn't even click and hold to see, well, what is this link to? Is it reputable? Do I believe it? Is it a government statistic? Is it an academic paper? Is it just some random blog where someone came up with a statistic out of thin air? We don't do that due diligence on a phone. I mean, it's impossible. If you're riding on the subway, to work, and you've got your little phone just kind of shaking around, on the subway, you're not going to be able to open up all these tabs and research. You just take it and run with it. And, that's a real challenge to me. So I think focusing on information literacy, and that really starts very young. Teaching, certainly, again, when I went through school, Montessori and on through, that was a big focus of thinking, well, when you see a piece of information, where did that come from? What is the provenance of that? Not just, well, I read it in the local newspaper. Where did they get it from? As a historian, and that's the thing, when I highly recommend that even engineers be forced to take history classes, not just the general gen ed, but real history classes where you learn first and secondary and tertiary sources. You learn about provenance. You learn about, specifically, the most important thing is you learn about the goals, the motivations of someone. And that's the thing, when we talk about government leaks, when you work with, say, folks in the historical community that deals with government, and you say, well, the government today leaked, the White House leaked this. There's no such thing as a unmotivated leak. There's always a reason for it. Why is that? And what's kind of going with that? And so thinking about asking those hard questions. Again, my PhD is information science from a library school. And so that's the big thing, is thinking about these questions. Because ultimately, if we can create a society where people think critically, we may not all agree. We may not all have the same sense of what's real and what's not real. But we at least are able to think. We don't just see something and run with it and say, oh my God, did you see that? Elvis is back. We start thinking critically. And I think that would go a long ways towards starting that process of addressing a lot of these things. But most importantly, you think about social platforms. If we think about information literacy, that's going to put pressure on social platforms to start restoring provenance. And something I've talked with the platforms many, many times about, when someone posts an image, what about adding in like if it's from a wire service, if someone posts an image from a known wire service and captions it as something wildly different, I mean, if this is from Reuters and you license Reuters, why not just put the original caption from Reuters underneath that? So people can see, hey, this is the actual caption. I mean, again, that's a trivial step, but will go a huge way. Because again, we talk about deep fakes and they're very, very real and very dangerous. But the vast majority of image falsehoods that we see, again, we rip out all this imagery that we see in news media around the world and process it. And one of the number one things that we see when we kind of compare that to social media is so much of this imagery, it's very real imagery. It's not a deep fake. It's not a digitally altered image. It's a legitimate image that's been repurposed either maliciously or completely accidentally, but just adding context back in. If someone tweets out an article and says, hey, this article says X, maybe just add in a little summary, add in a few little, maybe even just take that little thing and add a little quote from the article that matches semantically what that person's saying to add that extra context. I mean, again, as an academic, I can't tell you how, and this again is beyond journalism and social media. I cannot tell you how many academic papers and major journals will cite one of my papers and cite it completely wrong. They'll say, according to Leetaru, 99% of tweets have GPS tags. Did you even read my article? Like, that's a trivial thing to put in there. But then in turn, that goes out and that gets cited and cited and cited. So again, restoring literacy, forcing people to go back to sources, I think would be a huge step forward towards helping this question.
Thank you. I hope we can do some of that. That would be great. Chris, we have a question from Arlette Laurent, who asks, while maintaining and defending the freedom of expression, how can democratic governments rein in disinformation and nefarious information that might directly or indirectly incite people to violence, including death threats and the destruction of property? And are there cultural and legal differences in the interpretation of freedom of expression in countries that are considered democratic?
Wow, I mean, there's a lot there to dive into. One thing, I'll take it kind of backwards and just say that there are really profound differences in what is considered freedom of expression and the kind of right to a freedom of expression. And I think part of the real challenge within this debate, it's particularly relevant for extremism, but also for for kind of disinformation, the United States has a First Amendment, right? Like this kind of absolute right, or close to absolute right to free speech. Most other democracies around the world do not have like a constitutional amendment guaranteeing freedom of expression. It's just kind of something that's been elaborated in different forms of law throughout their system. That actually has some pretty profound implications because so many of the major kind of tech platforms are actually based in the United States. First Amendment has kind of governed a lot of the policy attempts to try and wrestle with, how governments should respond to some of the online harms that have appeared alongside the rise of social media. There's a lot of governments, whether it's in Europe or other democracies around the world, that want to be a little bit more proactive than the United States has been. The United States probably never really will be that proactive because of the First Amendment, right? It places fundamental constraints on what Congress is going to do to rein in social media platforms. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing, but to get back to the question itself, I just want to note that there's a really profound difference, even among democratically aligned countries, between the kind of guarantees and the strength of the guarantees for freedom of expression in the United States and elsewhere. And by virtue of the kind of American, the fact that so many large big media or big tech kind of companies are based in the United States, that has kind of historically played a major role in how tech policy debates over the governance of free speech have played out. That said, as far as kind of how governments can push back on information that might lead to violence, I think there's kind of I think a few things. One is that I'd love to see greater use of kind of legal powers that are already in place, right? So that there's kind of law enforcement. If somebody's kind of online saying, I want to, kill or encouraging people to kill certain figures, there are already legal remedies in place to try and address that kind of thing because it's a credible incitement to violence. The harder issue is what about like statements that are kind of dehumanizing towards certain outgroups, and that could be seen as contributing to the incitement to violence in some way. I'm thinking in particular like hate speech, right? So a few years ago in the United States, we had, I believe it was the head of the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, Michael Flynn, kind of come out with a tweet saying like fear of Muslims is rational, right? And it's like, that's a statement that, you know, I think to a lot of people would dehumanize an entire class of citizen within the United States. I think it could be seen as contributing to a larger discourse in which violence against Muslims was normalized. But it's also not an explicit kind of violation of, or an explicit incitement of speech in the way that kind of the state can take legal action. And that's where I think platforms and social media platforms in particular have a responsibility to develop really robust policies about what kind of speech they want to have on their platform, and what kind of speech they're comfortable hosting on their platform, even if it's legal. There's this whole category of speech that's kind of become known as awful but lawful speech, right? Like it's the disinformation and kind of incitement to violence that is not, you know, there's no legal reason for it to be removed, but at the same time, it can contribute to societal harms. And I think thankfully, the tech platforms have, I think, done a better job of trying to accept responsibility for that and begun to be a little bit more proactive in the kinds of moderation and governance that they're doing. But there's a lot more that I think could be done, in particular around transparency of the scope of the problem. I think we still don't really have a great sense of, you know, how common it is to see, you know, disinformation that's designed to incite violence against or dehumanize a particular subgroup of people. And so it's really hard to judge like how effective some of these new policies have been because we just don't have visibility into how information is operating. So there's a lot we can do, but that's where I'll leave it for right now.
Thank you. I'm going to try to pick up a little bit on that thread and do some sort of acrobatics here and combine two questions, and also kind of rehash some of what you said before, Kalev. So we have, so one question we have is someone who's asking whether should social media giants like Facebook and Twitter have regulations on what users can post on those sites, and what would these regulations look like? What would their impacts be on freedom of speech in the US and internationally? So kind of picking up on that thread. But then also too, because like you said, this is a very complex environment, right? And you were alluding earlier to other ways that people can become more information literate. And one user wants to know whether or not there are ways to address that aspect technologically. So sort of like you were citing, I think, with the photos and the captions. And then my own piece, just to add on to that, what needs to be done for that to happen? And again, you referenced education of you know, some of the engineers, making that more robust. So kind of a three, you know, looking both at the government piece, the actual technology piece, and then the people behind the technology, in terms of keeping misinformation or disinformation down to a, you know, dull roar.
Absolutely. You know, and I completely agree with Chris's comment about leveraging existing laws. And, you know, one of the things that I wrote about in a past piece was, you know, there was this historical case, I think it was in the 60s, of a political ad that was run, I believe, in Georgia, where, you know, this very horrific candidate said some very horrific things. And that was actually his ad. You know, it was actually termed "the white racist" was actually his actual tagline that he ran on. And so you saw a lot of threats to radio stations of firebombings and others. And the FCC, it actually went up to the FCC. And there was a ruling that, no, we are not going to censor that speech because it's not quite at the level of violence yet. If an act of violence occurs, then you can censor it. And so for all the comments that Donald Trump said about, well, you know, social media has no right to remove me, et cetera, simply under these existing, you know, laws that, I mean, again, FCC rules don't govern Twitter. But still, like under that existing rule for radio, he would have been removed at that point because violence had occurred. And so one of the things that, you know, I think there could be a lot, there is there's a huge body of laws and other things that we've already established for existing media, whether it's print or radio or others. We have a lot of these things, whether it's dehumanizing speech, whether it's calls to violence. There's a lot of case history there of when those different thresholds are cut. We sort of say, well, none of that applies to the digital world. But it's sort of like we're tossing out this long history here of, well, maybe there's a lot we could learn that could apply to that. So I just want to kind of put that there. But yeah, I think there's huge things. I think one of the challenges of allowing governments to define what's allowed for social media is, again, obviously, if you are one political party, do you really want the other political party to suddenly be able to censor what they don't like? But also in countries like India, for example, we saw use some of these very powers to say, those farmers' protests, that's an actual, is a democratic society. We have a group of people with potentially very legitimate grievances there. And the government, again, leveraging this very power to silence that. You've seen other governments that have said criticism of government falls under counterterrorism laws, so we need to remove those. So I'm always very hesitant because, again, looking at that global perspective, there are a lot of governments that if we sort of say, hey, every government, now again, some governments already have those powers and they do leverage them to terrible effect to censor. So I'm a little bit hesitant to kind of go down that route, but certainly context. Like one of the tools that one of the experiments that we've done, we've taken, for example, television broadcasts, like a CNN broadcast, and gone second by second and searched the open web for what was displayed on screen at that moment. So you can actually see where else is this appearing? How is this contextualized? What was the original source of this material? Again, we take all this imagery out of news media and we catalog that. And we've actually done some experiments where you can say, hey, here's a tweet, and someone says, here's a protest that occurred in Tehran 10 minutes ago. Well, we can tell you, hey, that image has been on the web for 10 years, not 10 minutes. So actually, this obviously is not from 10 minutes ago. It's Egyptian Arabic in the background. So this is not, from a language perspective, those storefronts aren't matching. And we can tell you also the caption that everywhere this image has appeared in the past, it's usually captioned Cairo, it's not captioned Tehran there. So probably all those now again, even then you might not say, hey, this is false. So what you do is say, hey, here are, so you might just see under that image, hey, here's these different characteristics, or clustering stories together. So one of the things that we do is we have a tool that allows you to take a large narrative space and cluster that together and say, here's the whole range of media coverage of this story. So you can see, hey, and one of the things I like is that we call it a you are here map. So sort of here's the broader space, like vaccine microchips and vaccines. Here's that whole narrative space. You're over here in the section that says, there's microchips and they're going to do brain control and all this wonderful tricks and the remote control zombies. But when I look at the I am here map, that's this tiny little bit right here. The majority of the media is not in agreement with that. And that can be a really interesting indicator to say, hey, maybe I really feel this and I'm never going to change my belief. But if I'm just sort of encountering this story for the first time, like, what on earth is this? That can be a signal to say, hey, wait a second, there's something weird going on here. Maybe I'm not going to jump in with both feet. So again, context, again, if you have a deeply held belief, I'm never going to be able to persuade you. But so much of these falsehoods are things where I think adding that little bit of extra context would go a huge way towards just helping people see, hey, there's another perspective there. And if I haven't already made up my mind, maybe that'll help me.
Great, thank you. Chris, we have a question here about other institutions that can, I guess, push back. So the writer asks, although journalists have been making an effort to be accountable for the veracity of the information they report, there have also been more and more disinformation initiatives that emerge outside of journalism. Okay, yes, so where do the responsibilities of journalists end and the responsibilities of the intelligence community start? It sounds like, I just want to make sure I'm digging into this question properly, that the questioner wants to know about the disinformation initiatives that journalists are trying to be accountable for their own information, and sort of where do their responsibilities end and the responsibilities of others start. So you can kind of extrapolate it as you will.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been a number of different efforts out there that I think have been really helpful in trying to improve the veracity of information. I think this kind of comes back to a point, though, that Kalev made earlier, which is most of the disinformation initiatives, kind of third-party independent verification services for information, it's really oriented towards misinformation or disinformation related to like specific facts, right? Like was the election certified as legitimate or not? That's an answerable question that we know. And if you say that it's not, like, we can say that you're being, false. What is the appropriate response to inflation is a much different kind of question. And I think so that there's for some of the misinformation that's happening, or kind of what is being termed as fake news in different outlets, it's not really going to help you in those kind of questions that are more about either opinions or policy preferences and not just kind of actual facts. But for certainly for anything that can be reduced to like a yes or no question, did this happen or is this true or not? I would love to see greater integration of these services within some of the wire services or kind of mainstream news media reporting. I think there's a lot of ways that you could integrate them into their editorial workflow so that it would flag false information. Kalev mentioned earlier this example of like some of his papers have been miscited, like just in ways that are like I think I haven't read the paper that Kalev mentioned, but like just based on the numbers he was throwing up, it should be obvious to anyone that was the wrong information, right? Like if you have any kind of sense of that space, like that's the wrong number. I think there's ways that you could create editorial content workflows that would kind of flag that kind of misinformation or disinformation from getting into accurate reporting. The second piece is that especially as the distribution of news and the distribution of journalism has moved online, there's ways that like mainstream social media platforms can also verify information using these third-party checkers. They've begun to do so, but I think to some of Kalev's points earlier, I think there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit about integrating third-party fact checkers and verification services into not just the production of news and journalism, but the consumption of it on the reader and user's ends. And I think there's just a lot more we can do there that hopefully we can start to put in place in the coming years.
Great, thanks. Interesting question for you, Kalev. The questioner asks, what's going on within the information ecosystems of local communities? Has all rhetoric been globalized?
This is the fascinating thing, is that the loss of local community. And that's where a lot of this comes down, is it's not just social media centralizing things, it's the fact that we're losing local journalism. You look at those maps of, going back of local journalism, you see it's just being wiped out. And that also, that goes to, when we talk about, a lot of times when what Donald Trump would say fake news, he wasn't actually referring to a fact or not fact. He was referring to attention to a topic. So he would say, well, it's fake news that they're spending, they're not covering this topic or they're spending too much time on that topic. Again, it's because we live in these different communities, we're affected by the world in different ways. I think that, you think about the loss of community sense. I mean, decline of community that, you think about once upon a time in America, you were born in an area, you probably lived there, died in that one area. There was this real sense of kind of interaction. And, now those interactions are globalized. You think about, cyberbullying. It used to be if you were bullied in school, it started and ended at the schoolhouse, maybe kind of moved to the neighborhood, but that was it. Today, someone's more likely to tweet something horrific, and now it becomes a global incident. And so this is kind of that globalization of local, where even the smallest things, you look at all these horrific tragedies of, just the fact that the tiniest little thing becomes global now, I do think has a very corrosive impact on our ability to kind of reach across the divide, to find others. It also, again, to Chris's point with dehumanizing speech, if maybe there's only 5 people on earth that hold a certain view, today it's very easy for them to find those other 5 people and to believe that there's this huge community and that they are the dominant kind of viewpoint there. So I do think that there's a lot of, and I keep coming back to Usenet. You look at the early days of Usenet, it was about forging community. It was about forging community. Social media is a broadcast world. I mean, you think about Twitter, it's actually really interesting. One of my old papers actually looked at how often do we retweet, how often do we talk to someone, kind of these conversations. And if you look at how often I talk to someone physically near me versus someone the other side of the world, back when I did that paper, it was equal. We talked to someone right near me exactly as often as I talk to someone on the other end of the planet. And so it's you think about like Twitter, it's about talking to the world, not having a conversation. It's about screaming to the world, really, not even having a dialogue. Facebook fixes that a little bit. But if you look at the old days of Usenet, I would join a community and each individual group had the right to, they could have their own moderation. So I could have, same topic, maybe issues in, conflict, in a particular conflict, you would have a myriad of different groups reflecting all these different views and each one having their own policies. So I was protected from a lot of that stuff. I could choose a community that, that was more local, whether it was, and you're seeing some of these kind of geographic social media platforms, they're restoring that. But I do think the globalization of local and the loss of kind of this long-term that sense of belonging and community, I think is having a very corrosive impact. To what degree that feeds into mis and disinformation, I do think, think about even 50 years ago when you had an issue at school. You went to the library, the school librarian, and we did your homework, or even local members of the community. You go to the reference library, your local library, and you'd say, hey, I'm trying to sort this out. Reference, again, coming from a library school, reference librarians are your friends. They're amazing people. But we don't do that. We literally, there's a paid person who generates their salary to sit at the local library and answer questions, and we're more likely to trust a random stranger on Twitter. That says something.
Yes. As a quick follow-up to that, but before we start to wrap up, one questioner asks, which media is more likely to be dominated or influenced by an owner with a political agenda? Local newspapers and local TV news, or national outlets? And is there a difference between what you're seeing both, domestically in the US or abroad?
You see that everywhere. One of the benefits of even rewind the clock not that much, most large cities had dozens of newspapers. It wasn't that long ago that, a city like New York City, when my father was growing up, had so many papers there. And each one, yes, different ownership, different political slants. But because it was a confluence, I was consuming all these, that yes, this paper wasn't running a particular story, but this one would, because they were different. So even if you have ownership, as long as you have that rich, kind of different perspectives all mentioned there, but most, many cities now have one or two dominant papers. Many cities, small towns, only one now. Even small towns, you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 papers. You're lucky in a small town if you have one paper anymore. So I do think that loss of that is a big deal. And so it's local and national. And it's really, again, that loss of voices, essentially. Everybody has a voice now, but the ability to have those voices heard, that curation of all those voices, is essentially, we're all stuck in a stadium and we're all trying to scream over each other and the loudest voice wins. And you think about it, the ones who are most informed, like take the public policy with COVID, the ones that the public health officials, take that doctor in the emergency room, people who actually were in the front lines of this, they don't have time to sit on Twitter all day. And they're much more likely to use measured language, like, here's what we know, instead of the person who's can sit on Twitter all day saying, no, seriously, there's microchips in there. That's the voice that's going to elevate, that crazy voice, because that's the one everybody's going to talk to, versus this very clinical kind of, this is what we know, this is what we don't know at this moment about this variant. That's going to go away because it's not exciting. It's not inflammatory.
Just as a really quick wrap up with both of you, and starting with you, Chris, what would you most want to see right now happen in order to put things on the right track?
I would, well, two things. One, I think we need to empower more librarians around, if only in honor of Kalev. I think it's certainly at a local level, like let's get librarians front and center in our information environment. Then the second would just be to kind of come back to something I've flagged a few times now, which is just greater transparency into the distribution of information online, and better understanding both of how algorithms work and what impact they're having, which will require, I think, more partnerships between civil society and tech platforms. I think that it's hard to know what the right answer is until you know the full scope of the problem and what it is you're dealing with. And I think that's the immediate next step there.
Great. What about you, Kalev?
I think, again, it's local, returning to that trust, returning to, adding context. Again, the tools are there. The companies with the different, whether it's exploitation imagery, whether it's terrorism imagery, the platforms have built these elaborate digital, signature systems that can say, hey, this image is a variant of this image. They're using it for like copyright, all those things. But what about leveraging those same tools you already deployed for things like adding context and saying, hey, this image, this is actually from the New York Times yesterday. Here's the caption that went with it. No, this isn't this. This is actually what it was. Little steps like that. Those are baby steps. The tooling's all there. The platform, everything exists. It's just that willingness to say, hey, let's do this. I think that would be a huge thing. Again, just adding context and information literacy, I think, would be huge.
Well, let's hope we can do that. Thank you both so much for joining us a fascinating conversation, in part dispiriting and also a little bit hopeful that we can reuse some of this technology. Really appreciate the time, really appreciate all the fantastic questions. I'm sorry I did not get to all of them. Just for those of you who might be interested, next week we do have a couple of briefings coming up. Our first one is on the Wagner Group, so Putin's army and Russia's influence abroad, and that is next Tuesday, so this same time at 12 p.m. And following that, we have one, I don't know if I have a slide for it, but it's about South Africa and whether or not its democracy has failed, and that's on the 28th. So thank you all for joining us, in particular, Chris and Kalev, really appreciate it. And have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks. Bye
Thank
now.
you so much for having us.